As we discussed in the first video on required minimum distribution, the last thing in the world you want is to spend down your principal. So are your IRAs allocated properly? Are they prepared for RMDs? The general rule is that you want your IRAs to earn enough interest and dividends to satisfy your RMDs. If you don't, then your RMD comes from principal. Notice that I didn't include capital gains or capital appreciation. That's because sometimes you invest for capital gains and instead you get capital losses. Sometimes you invest for growth and you end up getting shrinkage. Now, as it turns out, a retiree taking RMDs during the 80s and 90s, the best bull market in history, could have invested completely for growth with virtually zero dividends and could have satisfied the RMDs from the growth. But since the year 2000, the opposite is true. If you're not generating enough interest and dividends to satisfy your RMDs, again, starting it at 3.7% at age 70 and increasing annually thereafter, then the rest comes out of your principal. To coin an adage that your parents probably told you many, many years ago, your goal should be to live off your interest and never spend your principal. Spending any principal at all, especially during the early years of retirement, can be a real slippery slope. And here's why. Think of a 30-year mortgage. At the beginning, on your first payment, are you paying back much principal at all? Of course not. At the beginning, you're paying primarily interest and just a little bit of principal. But each year that goes on, you pay a little less interest and a little more principal as the balance gets paid down. Somehow, miraculously, by the time the 30 years goes by, your mortgage is paid off. Now think about this in reverse. Think about a pool of money, let's say $1 million, generating a 5% a year. If you take just a little bit more than that $50,000 a year, just a little bit of principal, that sum will be depleted within 30 years. Much like that mortgage is paid off, with the cold hard facts saying that life expectancies are getting longer and longer these days, many people retiring are having to plan for 30 years or more. The problem today, of course, is it's harder and harder to generate the kind of interest you need to satisfy your RMDs without touching the principal. Clearly, if you're in a bank CD right now, you're probably not making 3.7%. If you're in high quality bond mutual funds, you're most likely still shy of that 3.7% after you factor in the management fees and so on. Additionally, you're taking significant risk to principal in these forms of interest rate risk with these alternatives. If you're in a diversified stock portfolio or stock mutual fund portfolio, it's most likely that you're not earning enough interest or dividends annually to satisfy the RMDs. And if you're selling shares of stock or stock mutual funds every year to satisfy the RMDs, then you're doing something which I refer to as reverse dollar cost averaging. When you were younger and saving on a regular basis for your retirement, such as in a 401k, you were dollar cost averaging. The purpose of dollar cost averaging is to get your average cost or the purchase price down. Remember that investing is simple but not easy. The simple part is to buy low, sell high. Dollar cost averaging was often touted as a strategy that helped you buy low. Let's take an example. If you were to set out to buy $100 per month of a mutual fund and the first month the fund was worth $10 a share, then you bought 10 shares. But let's say the unthinkable happens and the second month the fund drops to $5 a share. You decide to stick with your plan. Now in the second month, at a $5 a share, your $100 bought you 20 shares. So the question I have for you is simple. If you were to stop after 2 months, what is your average cost per share? If you said $7.50, you're not alone. And it seems intuitive. But the real answer, if your average cost per share was $6.66. You see, because you bought twice as many shares at $5 and half as many shares at $10, it helps you buy low. Dollar cost averaging helps you get your average cost down. The problem, however, is that now you're at a point where you're not saving on a monthly basis anymore. Instead, you're going to have to begin, if you haven't already, taking required minimum distributions on a regular basis from your IRA. That means now you're going to have to liquidate funds on a regular basis. In other words, reverse dollar cost averaging. So let's use the same example. Let's say the first month you liquidate $100 and you sell 10 shares. The second month, the unthinkable happens and the fund drops in half. Now to withdraw $100, you have to sell twice as many shares. Therefore, you sold 20 shares. You've been forced by the IRS to sell more shares in a down market. So now what's your average sales price per share? Where the math is the same. Now instead of taking your purchase price down from $7.50 to $6.66, you've taken your sales price and you've pushed it down. Now, you want to buy low, but do you really want to sell low? Of course not. That's why reverse dollar cost averaging hurts you. It pushes your sales price downward. Dollar cost averaging is one of those things that works great in one direction and horrible in the other direction. It's kind of like toothpaste. Toothpaste is great when you're trying to get it out of the tube, but have you ever tried to get it back into the tube? So whereas dollar cost averaging is a great strategy for young savers, reverse dollar cost averaging is one of the most cancerous strategies you can embark upon. That's why if you're going to have money in the stock market, in your IRA during retirement, you want to make sure that you're earning enough interest or dividends to satisfy your RMDs. But then, as I've said before, because it's so difficult today to earn a reasonable amount of dividends on the average stock portfolio, the question becomes, should you have any money at all in the stock market? In your IRA, 403b, 401k, or 457 plan once you've retired. That's why people typically roll over these qualified plans into IRAs before they retire. Now that may seem like a radical question at the first blush because of all things that we've been taught before. Everyone has to have some money in the stock market. Or, well, people are living longer these days, so you need to have some money in the stock market as an inflation hedge. The problem, though, is the stock market has never served as a very reliable inflation hedge. In fact, let me ask you a question. Do you believe, generally speaking, that history tends to repeat itself more often than not? If you answered yes to that question, as most generally do, you might be surprised to find that there are huge periods of times throughout market history when the stock market served as a good inflation hedge, and a huge period of time when it served as a terrible inflation hedge. So there are times when an IRA holder can stay healthily invested in the stock market and take his gains out as a predictable capital appreciation. But also times where those RMDs would have to come out of principal because there were no gains. And as it turns out, historically speaking, these periods have been very predictable and repeatable throughout history. And it might very well just be the best indicator to help you determine how much of your money should remain in stocks or the stock mutual funds, for that matter, in your IRAs or 401ks and so forth, now that you're on the precipice of having to take government-forced required minimum distributions. Stay tuned for our next video, Market History, where we'll spend a little time on exactly how those predictable and repeatable those market cycles have been throughout nearly 200 years of history.